Every argument about the best fighter of World War II ends the same way. Someone says P-51 Mustang, everyone nods, conversation over. It's been like that for 80 years. Clean lines, bubble canopy, that unmistakable silhouette screaming across the screen in every documentary ever made about the air war in Europe. The Mustang is the poster child of American air power, and questioning its supremacy feels almost unpatriotic. But there was a Spitfire variant that was faster, that climbed at rates 40 to 60% greater, that turned tighter, hit harder, and chased down things no piston-engined fighter had any business catching. Its pilots engaged Messerschmitt 262 jets, the most advanced combat aircraft on the planet, and won. It destroyed more V-1 flying bombs than any other Spitfire variant, racing after pulse jet cruise missiles at treetop height to stop them from slamming into London neighbourhoods. The RAF's own wartime evaluation, conducted by professionals whose only job was telling pilots what would keep them alive and what would get them killed, confirmed it outperformed the Mustang in nearly every air combat parameter that mattered. You've probably never heard of it. It's the Spitfire Mark XIV. And the reason you haven't heard of it has nothing to do with how well it flew, and everything to do with how many were built. 957. That's the total. Every single Mark XIV that ever left a factory floor. Compare that to 15,586 Mustangs of all variants produced by North American Aviation between 1941 and 1945. 15,000 against 900. In the contest for historical memory, those numbers were always going to produce one winner and one ghost. But here's the thing. This isn't a hit piece on the Mustang, not even close. The P-51 was strategically essential in a way the Mark XIV never could have been, and we're going to talk about exactly why that's true. What this really is, instead, is an argument that the best dogfighter of the war and the most important fighter of the war were two entirely different aeroplanes, and the one that mattered more to winning the war didn't necessarily win the fight. So, let's talk about what sat in the nose. To understand the Mark XIV, you need exactly one number. The original Spitfire, the Mark I that defended Britain in the summer of 1940, was powered by the Rolls-Royce Merlin III, a 27-litre engine producing 1,030 horsepower. Legendary, iconic. Arguably the most celebrated aero engine in aviation history, and the mechanical heart of the aeroplane that held the line during the Battle of Britain and across half a dozen subsequent marks. That Merlin howl at an airshow still raises the hair on your neck, and for good reason. It's the sound of civilization not quite going under. By 1943, Rolls-Royce had readied something altogether more savage. The Griffin 65 displaced 36.7 litres, nearly 10 litres more than the Merlin, and produced 2,050 horsepower. That's not a modest upgrade, that's nearly double the power of the original engine, crammed into an airframe that was only marginally heavier, still wearing those famous elliptical wings, still recognisably a Spitfire to anyone who saw it from a distance. Up close, the differences were obvious. The Griffin turned a 5-blade rotol propeller instead of the 3- or 4-blade units of earlier Marks, and the nose was longer, bulkier, slightly brutal-looking in a way the sleek Merlin-engined Marks never were. It looked like what it was, a refined machine that had swallowed something feral. And the result wasn't just a faster Spitfire, it was a fundamentally different animal. An aeroplane that didn't so much fly in the same register as its predecessors as obliterate it entirely. 1,030 horsepower to 2,050. Same basic airframe. That's the Mark XIV's opening argument, and it's a devastating one. Now, what did all that power actually deliver in the air? Because numbers in an engine spec sheet don't mean much unless they translate into performance where it counts, at altitude, under fire, in the savage geometry of a dogfight, where half a second of advantage means the difference between a kill and a coffin. Top speed, 446 miles per hour in level flight at 25,400 feet. Some test reports with later boost clearances nudge towards 448, but 446 is the conservative, widely accepted figure from wartime trials. The P-51 Mustang, 437 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. 9 miles per hour faster. Doesn't sound like much sitting here on the ground, does it? But in the kinetic algebra of aerial combat, where closure rates and energy management determine who lives and who dies, that margin translates into something absolute. The faster pilot chooses when to fight and when to break off. The faster pilot dictates the terms. Every engagement begins and ends at the speed advantage holder's discretion. Period. The Mark XIV held that choice against the most celebrated fighter in the American inventory. But speed wasn't even where its advantage was most dramatic. Not by a long shot. Ask a fighter pilot which performance metric matters most, and most will tell you the same thing. Climb rate. Altitude is energy. Energy is options. Options are survival. The pilot who can get above his opponent first owns the fight before it even begins. He dives with gravity on his side, attacks with the sun behind him, and if things go wrong, he pulls up and away into airspace his opponent can't reach. And the Mark XIV climbed like absolutely nothing else in the Allied inventory. At standard boost settings of plus 18 pounds, the Griffin 65 hauled the aircraft skyward at 4,580 feet per minute. Think about that for a second. That's nearly a mile of altitude gained every 60 seconds from a standing start at sea level. Later production examples, cleared for plus 21 pounds of boost, pushed estimated climb rates past 5,000 feet per minute. Some wartime test data recorded figures approaching 5,200. The Mark XIV reached 20,000 feet in 5 minutes flat, 30,000 feet in roughly 8.5 minutes. Service ceiling, 43,000 feet. At 40,000 feet, where the air is thin enough to kill an unprotected human in minutes, the Mark XIV was still climbing at 810 feet per minute. Still going up when most fighters had long since run out of sky. The P-51D? Between 3,200 and 3,475 feet per minute. Service ceiling about 41,900 feet. Good numbers. Genuinely respectable numbers for a superb aircraft. But not in the same conversation as the Mark XIVs, and every honest assessment of both aircraft acknowledges that gap. We're talking about a 40 to 60% advantage in the single metric that experienced fighter pilots rate as the most critical in combat. That's not a margin, that's a different league. Pilots transitioning from Merlin engine Spitfires to the Mark XIV didn't describe the experience as incremental. They described it as startling. And these were men who already knew what a Spitfire felt like, who'd grown up in the cockpit of one of the finest fighters ever designed. The aircraft could sustain steep, aggressive climbing maneuvers that earlier Marks simply couldn't hold. Approaches that gave the visceral, gut-level impression of near-vertical performance at lower altitudes. No piston-engine fighter could truly sustain a vertical climb for any extended duration. Physics is physics. But the Mark XIV came closer than almost anything else in the sky. It felt, according to the men who actually strapped into it, like the aeroplane wanted to go up more than it wanted to go forward. That sensation mattered. A pilot who trusts his machine fights differently than one who's nursing it. And turning, the third pillar of any dogfight, still belonged to the Spitfire. Always had. That elliptical wing, with its relatively low wing loading, gave the type an inherent advantage in turning engagements against heavier American and German fighters from the very first Mark. The Mark XIV, despite carrying the bigger, heavier Griffin, retained this quality. The wing hadn't fundamentally changed. What had changed was that more power meant less energy bled in a sustained turn. The aircraft could pull harder and recover faster than virtually anything in its weight class. The Mustang's laminar flow wing was a different design philosophy altogether, optimized for speed and range, not maneuverability. Its higher wing loading showed in a turning fight, emphatically, faster, climbed dramatically harder, turned tighter, higher ceiling. 3 out of 4 fundamental combat parameters, and the fourth, dive speed, was the only category where the Mustang's heavier weight and cleaner aerodynamics gave it a consistent edge. So why isn't this aircraft on every poster, in every documentary, on the nose of every warbird enthusiast's cap? One word: range. And to understand range, you have to understand the catastrophe that made the Mustang not just useful, but existentially necessary. Because this is where better fighter and more important fighter diverge so sharply they never come back together. And the distinction explains nearly everything about how the Air War's history got written. From the heavy bomber bases of the 8th Air Force in East Anglia, the round trip to Berlin and back covered 1,150 to 1,200 miles. Every mile of that route was contested airspace. Every mile needed a fighter escort overhead because the bombers that flew without one came home in fractions. No Spitfire variant, not the Mark IX, not the Mark XIV, not any of them, could make that journey and fight in the middle of it. The Mark XIV's combat radius topped out at 300 to 350 miles, with a total range of roughly 460 miles on internal fuel. Fly to the Dutch border, fight for a few minutes, fly home. That was the envelope. That was all there was. The P-51 Mustang, loaded with external drop tanks, could cover 1,650 miles. Ferry range exceeded 2,000. Berlin and back with fuel to spare. Deep into the heart of the Reich, escort the heavies over the target. Tangle with whatever the Luftwaffe threw up, and fly home to a hot meal in Suffolk. That isn't a gap. It's a canyon with no bridge. And it's the reason the Mustang, not the Mark XIV, changed the course of the air war over Europe. 2 days in 1943 explain everything about why that range mattered more than any other specification in any fighter's datasheet. August 17, 1943. The 8th Air Force launches the Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission. 376 B-17 Flying Fortresses sent deep into Germany without fighter escort for the final, most dangerous portion of the route, because no Allied fighter could fly that far. 60 bombers didn't come home. 16% attrition. Sustain that rate for a few more missions, and the entire heavy bomber force simply ceases to exist. Burned through like ammunition with no resupply. Then came 14th of October 1943, 2nd Schweinfurt. 77 B-17 lost out of 291 dispatched. 26%, more than 1 in 4. They called it Black Thursday, and it effectively killed unescorted deep penetration bombing overnight. The pre-war fantasy that heavily armed bomber formations could fight their way to any target without fighter protection, the doctrine of the so-called bomber mafia, died screaming in the flak-torn skies over the ball-bearing factories of Schweinfurt. It died with hundreds of young men inside burning fuselages. And the men who survived knew precisely what the theory had cost. The crisis demanded one specific thing: a fighter that could escort the bombers all the way to the target and all the way home. The Spitfire, any Spitfire, couldn't. The P-47 Thunderbolt reached part way into Germany, then had to turn back. The P-38 Lightning had the legs, but suffered engine reliability nightmares in the bitter cold of high-altitude northern Europe, its Allison engines prone to failures that no amount of bravery could fix. The P-51 Mustang, marrying a superb North American airframe to a Rolls-Royce Merlin built under license by Packard as the V1650, was the answer. Berlin and back. Fight over the target. Fly home. Do it again tomorrow. And the day after that. So the factories built 15,586 of them. The strategic equation was brutally, almost absurdly simple. Destroy Germany's industrial capacity through strategic bombing. Bombers can't survive without escort. Only the Mustang has the range to provide that escort to the deepest targets. Build Mustangs. Build thousands of them. Build them until the Luftwaffe breaks under the cumulative weight of attrition it can no longer sustain. The Mark XIV, for all its superiority in a turning fight at 20,000 feet, couldn't solve the problem that was actually killing Allied aircrews by the hundred. Britain didn't need 15,000 short-range interceptors. America needed 15,000 long-range escorts. That single strategic reality, not any deficiency in the Mark XIV's combat performance, is why one aircraft was built by the Army and the other by the battalion. But the men whose actual job was to evaluate fighter aircraft in realistic combat conditions, not strategists, not politicians, not historians writing decades after the fact, they knew exactly what the Mark XIV was. February 1944. The Air Fighting Development Unit at RAF Wittering produces AFDU Report number 108. A formal comparative tactical trial, the kind of document that operational commanders used to make life and death decisions about which aircraft went where and did what. Spitfire Mark XIV versus the Mustang III. That's the RAF designation for the P-51B and P-51C, which were broadly comparable to the P-51D and in some respects marginally faster thanks to their lower drag Razorback fuselage before the bubble canopy replaced it. This wasn't a magazine article, wasn't an enthusiast's opinion offered over a beer. It was a wartime evaluation with immediate tactical consequences, conducted months before D-Day by an organisation that existed for one purpose: telling pilots what would work in a fight and what would get them killed. The findings were blunt. Maximum speed, practically identical. Maximum climb, the Spitfire 14 is very much better. Direct quote. Not marginally, not slightly, very much better, in the single parameter that fighter pilots consistently rate as the most decisive in air combat. Diving. Advantage Mustang, as it consistently was across all Spitfire variants. The Mustang's heavier weight and cleaner aerodynamics gave it better acceleration going downhill. Turning circle. Advantage Spitfire. Rate of roll, broadly similar. And here's the detail that really stings if you're wedded to the Mustang as king narrative. The AFDU tested the Mark XIV against the faster Mustang configuration, the Razorback P-51B/C, not the bubble canopy P-51D. The P-51D, with its canopy generating slightly more drag, was a touch slower than the B and C models at most altitudes. Against the P-51D specifically, the variant everyone pictures when they say greatest fighter of the war, the Mark XIV's advantages would have been fractionally greater still. The unit, whose sole reason for existence was evaluating fighters in combat conditions, had delivered its verdict. Officially, on paper, with a report number. So that's the spec sheet and the official wartime judgment. Impressive. But numbers on paper and professional evaluations under controlled conditions are one thing. What did the Mark XIV actually do when the shooting started? Because this is where the story stops being an engineering argument and turns into something raw. June 13th, 1944. Exactly 1 week after D-Day, while the invasion beaches were still being consolidated and the fate of the whole operation hung in the balance. The first V-1 flying bombs begin falling on London. Pulse jet cruise missiles, pilotless and relentless, each carrying 1,870 pounds of Amatol high explosive. They flew between 2,000 and 3,000 feet, low enough to see individual houses underneath, at speeds ranging from 340 to over 400 miles per hour. Later variants with improved engines exceeded 400 in level flight. That speed was the problem that turned the defence of London sideways. Most RAF fighters in service couldn't catch a V-1 in level pursuit at low altitude, where their engines produced significantly less power than at their optimum heights. Spitfire Mark XIVs struggled. Typhoons were too slow. The V-1 didn't care. It just kept coming, one after another, 4,000 of them raining down on a city that had already endured the Blitz and thought the worst was over. 2 aircraft proved fast enough to reliably run them down: the Hawker Tempest 5 and the Spitfire Mark XIV. Anti-Diver, that was the code name for the V-1 defence, tasked squadrons of these fast fighters with standing patrols over the Channel and the Kent countryside, flying back and forth across the lethal corridor between the French launch sites and London. Number 91 Squadron, Number 322 Dutch Squadron, Number 610 Squadron, among others, flew Mark XIVs in this role day after relentless day through the summer of 1944. Picture the tactical reality. A pilot spots the distinctive orange flame of a pulse jet engine streaking low across the Kent fields, trailing its signature rattling drone, the sound Londoners had learned to dread because silence meant the engine had cut out and the bomb was falling. He pushes the throttle forward, dives to intercept, closing on a small, fast-moving target at an altitude where margins for error simply don't exist. The ground is right there, filling the bottom of his windscreen. A burst that detonates the warhead at close range will destroy his own aircraft in the blast. A miss means the bomb continues on its course towards civilian London. Schools, hospitals, terraced houses packed with families who've already survived 4 years of war and thought they'd seen the worst of it. No opponent to outthink, no evasive maneuver to counter, just raw speed and steady nerves against a machine that doesn't flinch, doesn't tire, and doesn't care whether it lives or dies, because it was never alive in the first place. And then there was the tactic that still seems genuinely insane 8 decades later. When a pilot had expended his ammunition, or his guns had jammed, which happened far more often than anyone wanted to admit, he could fly in close formation with the V-1, slide his wingtip beneath the bomb's stubby wing, and roll sharply to flip it. The aerodynamic disruption upset the V-1's gyroscopic autopilot, sending the weapon spiralling into open countryside instead of a London neighbourhood. 300 miles per hour. Wingtip to wingtip, with a flying bomb carrying nearly a ton of high explosive, at heights where a single twitch meant death on impact with the ground below. A clumsy aeroplane couldn't have done it. A slow one would never have been in position to try. That anyone attempted this at all speaks to a kind of courage that defies rational analysis. That they succeeded repeatedly says something profound about both the pilots and the machine underneath them. Over the course of the anti-diver campaign, the Spitfire Mark XIV accounted for over 300 V-1 flying bombs destroyed, more than any other Spitfire variant. The Hawker Tempest 5 bore the heaviest overall load, with 638 kills, and the de Havilland Mosquito, flying primarily at night, claimed approximately 428. The Mark XIV sat third in the overall rankings, but was, among daytime fighters, the second deadliest V-1 killer after the Tempest. 300 bombs that never reached London. That's not a footnote, that's thousands of lives. As the Allied advance through France overran the launch sites in September 1944 and the V-1 threat receded, the Mark XIV's war shifted eastward, and its pilots found themselves facing something from the opposite end of the technological spectrum entirely. The Messerschmitt 262, world's first operational jet fighter. Top speed exceeding 540 miles per hour, 100 miles per hour faster than any piston-engined aircraft in existence. Its arrival sent a genuine chill through Allied air commands, a cold realization that the technological advantage the Allies had built through years of industrial effort could evaporate if the Germans got enough of these things into the air. The jet age had arrived mid-war, and it arrived wearing a Balkenkreuz. Credit where it's due, absolutely. The first confirmed Allied kill of an Me-262 in air-to-air combat belonged to American P-47 Thunderbolts. On August 28, 1944, Major Joseph Myers and his wingman Lieutenant Manford Croy of the 78th Fighter Group, United States Army Air Forces, brought one down near Brussels, catching the jet at low altitude and reduced speed. Other kills by various Allied types followed through September as pilots learned the 262's fatal weakness, devastating at high speed, desperately vulnerable when slow. Its jet engines were sluggish to accelerate, which meant the aircraft was exposed during takeoff, landing, and speed transitions. A narrow window, but a real one. On October 5, 1944, pilots of No. 401 Squadron, Royal Canadian Air Force, flying Spitfire Mark XIV with the 2nd Tactical Air Force over the continent, engaged and destroyed a Messerschmitt 262. They caught it where jets could be caught, in transition, before it had built the speed that made it untouchable. That a piston-engine Spitfire could position itself to kill the most technologically advanced combat aircraft on the planet speaks to both the tactical intelligence of its pilots and the Mark XIV's fundamental capability. Fast enough to close the distance in the seconds available. Agile enough to track an accelerating target. Powerful enough to climb into a firing solution when that window cracked open for a few brutal heartbeats and then slammed shut. This wasn't a fluke. Mark XIVs continued to encounter and engage Me-262s through the war's final months. A piston-engined fighter, repeatedly punching above its technological weight class against an aircraft that represented the future of aerial warfare. And winning. The people closest to this aircraft understood what it was. On both sides of the conflict, Jeffrey Quill, Supermarine's chief test pilot, the man who flew virtually every Spitfire Mark from the prototype onward, who felt each iteration of the design through his hands and his spine and the seat of his flight suit, called the Mark XIV a splendid aeroplane in every respect. 7 words from a man who'd flown them all. Every mark, every variant, every incremental change that Supermarine had wrung from R.J. Mitchell's original 1936 design over nearly a decade of relentless development. Quill had the authority to compare the Mark XIV against every Spitfire that came before it, and his verdict was unequivocal. Not qualified, not hedged, splendid in every respect. And then there's the enemy's assessment. which might be the most telling evidence of all.
When the war ended and senior Luftwaffe officers were debriefed about which Allied fighters they feared and respected most, the late Mark Griffin engine Spitfires earned a regard that sat uncomfortably with the post-war American narrative. Adolf Galland, the General der Jagdflieger who commanded Germany's fighter forces and flew combat missions himself, a man with no conceivable reason to flatter the British, rated the late Griffin Spitfires among the most formidable opponents his pilots faced. The Luftwaffe didn't care about production statistics or escort doctrine or whose factories built what. They cared about one thing: what's trying to kill me right now, in this engagement, at this altitude, in this moment. And the Mark XIV, in competent hands, was among the most lethal answers the European sky could provide. When the man who ran the enemy's entire fighter force tells you your aircraft was exceptional, that's not British bias talking. That's the opposition's scouting report. Which brings us to the question buried at the centre of all this, the one that matters more than any speed figure or climb rate or kill tally. Why does none of it show up in the popular story of the Second World War? Because 15,586 Mustangs meant 15,000 stories. 15,000 pilots who came home, raised families, and told their grandchildren about the finest fighter they ever flew. 15,000 airframes filtering into the post-war world, filling air shows, thundering across sun-baked tarmac at Reno, gracing the covers of aviation magazines for decades, showing up in Hollywood films as the visual shorthand for Allied air power. The cultural infrastructure of the most powerful media nation on Earth absorbed the P-51 into its mythology and never let go. Ubiquity became legend. Legend hardened into received fact. And nobody questioned it. Why would you? The evidence was everywhere. You could hear that Merlin engine at every fly-in from Oshkosh to Duxford. You could see the silhouette on posters, on caps, on the tails of restored warbirds polished to mirror shine. You could walk up and touch one. 957 Mark XIVs didn't generate that kind of cultural mass. Couldn't have. The Spitfire has its own mythology, of course, vast and deeply held, especially in Britain. But it's the mythology of 1940. The Mark I, with its three-blade prop and that Merlin howl over the white cliffs. The Battle of Britain. The few. When someone pictures a Spitfire, they picture the early war silhouette. They don't picture the five-blade, Griffin-powered brute that arrived 4 years later and outperformed everything in the sky. The Mark XIV entered squadron service in January 1944, when No. 610 Squadron took delivery at RAF Exeter. Too late for the Battle of Britain legend that defines the Spitfire in popular memory. Too few for statistical prominence in any survey of wartime production. Wrong nationality for the American media machine that would shape how much of the world remembered the air war for the next 80 years. It fell through every crack that history had to offer, not because it failed, but because it succeeded in too small a number, too late in the narrative, on the wrong side of the Atlantic. And that, really, is the deeper story here. Not just Spitfire versus Mustang. That argument's been done to death, and it'll never be settled, because both sides are right about different things. The deeper story is about how historical memory actually works. It doesn't track performance. It doesn't track capability. It doesn't even track combat results. Not really. It tracks volume, presence, repetition. The aircraft that shows up in greater numbers generates more stories, more photographs, more surviving examples, more cultural touchpoints.
And over decades, that accumulated weight becomes indistinguishable from truth.
The thing that was everywhere becomes the thing that was best, because our brains conflate frequency with importance. Always have, probably always will. 957 versus 15,586. The Mark XIV was faster than the P-51 Mustang. It climbed at rates up to 60% greater, 5,200 feet per minute against 3,475. It turned tighter. It chased down pulse jet cruise missiles at rooftop height and flipped them out of the sky with a wingtip. It killed Me-262 jets. The RAF's own wartime evaluation, AFDU Report 108, produced in February 1944 by the unit specifically tasked with comparative fighter assessment, called its climb advantage over the Mustang very much better. The man who test flew every Spitfire ever built called it Splendid in every respect. The general who commanded the entire Luftwaffe fighter force rated it among the most formidable opponents his pilots ever faced. None of it was enough to win the narrative. The Mustang won the war, genuinely. Its range made the strategic bombing campaign survivable. And that campaign, whatever its moral complexities, broke the industrial spine of the Third Reich. No Mark XIV could have done that job. Couldn't have even attempted it. The P-51 was the right tool for the mission that decided everything, and dismissing its contribution would be dishonest and absurd. But the Mark XIV won the fight. Every fight. By every measure that matters, when two fighters meet at 20,000 feet with nothing between them but skill, machinery, and the cold physics of who can climb faster, turn harder, and close the distance first. History remembered the one that showed up in greater numbers. It almost always does. And that might be the most important thing this aircraft teaches us. Not about aeroplanes, but about the way we decide what matters and what gets forgotten. So, was the Mark XIV the best fighter of the war? Depends entirely on whether you mean the best fighter or the most important one. And honestly, that's a question worth fighting about. Drop your answer in the comments. Subscribe for more stories like this.